The winter air was unforgiving, biting through the silence of a deserted road in rural Minnesota. Snow blanketed the landscape, turning the world into a vast white abyss. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting pale, trembling glows onto the frozen pavement below. Wind howled through narrow alleyways, whistling past abandoned storefronts and rattling street signs. The town was asleep, cocooned in the warmth of homes where fireplaces crackled and families huddled together. But out here, in the empty stretch of road, there was no warmth, only the relentless cold and the sound of an approaching vehicle. A black SUV rumbled down the road, its tires crunching over the icy surface before slowing to a stop near an old lamppost. Inside the car, Frank Dawson gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. His face was hardened, eyes staring straight ahead, unwilling to meet the reflection of his own guilt in the rearview mirror. The passenger seat was empty, save for a worn leather leash. The back seat, however, was occupied. Max, a 4-year-old German shepherd, sat with ears perked and tail wagging softly against the seat. His breath fogged up the window as he peered outside, his brown eyes filled with curiosity and trust. To him, this was just another car ride, another moment with his owner. He had been trained well. Obedience was second nature, loyalty an instinct. Whatever Frank asked of him, he would do without question. The engine idled for a moment, the faint hum blending with the distant whisper of the wind. Frank exhaled sharply, his fingers tapping against the dashboard as if hesitating. Then, without looking back, he reached for the door handle and stepped out. The cold hit instantly, but he barely registered it. He moved to the back door, opening it with a mechanical motion. Max's ears twitched. His tail wagged a little faster. He was excited. Maybe they were going for a walk. Maybe there was an adventure waiting just outside. He leaped forward slightly, his paws pressing against the seat as he waited for a command. Frank didn't say much. He reached in, unfastened Max's collar, and in a low, unreadable voice, muttered, "Go on." Max hesitated. Something about Frank's tone was different tonight. Usually there was encouragement, a pat on the head, or at least a nod of approval. But now, there was only silence. Still, he obeyed. Carefully, he stepped down onto the frozen pavement, his paws pressing into the thin layer of snow. The air was sharp against his fur, but he barely noticed. His focus was on Frank, waiting for the next instruction. But Frank didn't look at him. Instead, the door shut. Firm. Final. The sound was loud against the hush of the winter night. Max flinched slightly, his ears tilting back in confusion. His tail gave a small wag, uncertain. He stepped forward, nose nudging at Frank's coat as if seeking reassurance. That's when the car door on the driver's side opened. Frank climbed back in, gripping the wheel once more. The engine revved. Max's ears shot up. His tail stilled. The realization didn't come all at once, but in slow, dawning horror. The car was moving. At first, Max simply trotted forward, his paws clicking against the ice as he followed. He had followed Frank for years, always by his side, always listening. He would follow him anywhere. But then the vehicle picked up speed. Max barked once. A small, confused sound. Then again, louder, more desperate. The SUV continued down the road. His trot turned into a run, his legs pushing forward with everything he had. His breath came in frantic bursts, rising in white clouds against the night air. His paws slipped on the icy pavement, but he didn't stop. Frank wasn't stopping. The reality hit him like a gust of cold wind straight to the chest. His barks grew louder, carrying across the empty road, echoing into the dark. His claws scraped against the frozen ground, his muscles burning as he pushed harder, harder, harder. The taillights of the SUV grew smaller. Max tripped, his paws skidding on a patch of ice. He stumbled, his body hitting the snow with a muted thud. But still he scrambled to his feet, his legs trembling, pushing forward. The car was gone. Max stood in the middle of the road, panting, his breath ragged. His ears twitched at the silence, at the sound of the wind sweeping through the trees. His tail, once high with excitement, hung low between his legs. He turned in a slow, confused circle, searching, waiting. There was nothing. No car, no Frank, no familiar voice calling him back. Just the cold, just the empty night. Max stood there, frozen in place, as snowflakes drifted down, landing lightly on his fur. He did not shake them off. He did not move. Because for the first time in his life, Max was alone. The night stretched on, cold and unrelenting. Snow continued to fall, coating the empty road in an ever-thickening blanket of white. Max remained where he was, sitting on the frozen pavement, his breath rising in soft, misty clouds. His ears flicked at every distant sound, the whisper of the wind through the barren trees, the creaking of a nearby streetlight swaying under the force of the storm. But none of these sounds belonged to Frank. None of them signaled his return. Still, Max waited. His loyalty was unshaken, his trust unwavering. He had spent years by Frank's side, learning commands, following routines, being the perfect companion. Surely this was just a mistake. Surely Frank would come back. The cold wrapped around him like an invisible force, seeping deep into his muscles. His thick fur, once a source of warmth, was now coated with snowflakes that melted against his body, leaving behind a damp chill that clung to his skin. His paws tingled from the icy pavement, his tail curled tightly around him in a futile attempt to conserve heat. Yet he did not move. Minutes turned to hours. The distant hum of passing cars occasionally reached his ears, but they were far away, their headlights never slowing, never stopping for him. His stomach let out a soft, hollow growl, a reminder that his last meal had been that morning, a routine he had always taken for granted. The sound startled him, breaking through his dazed thoughts. Frank wasn't coming back. The realization came slowly, creeping into his mind like the chill in his bones. Max's ears flattened slightly, his nose lifting to sniff the air. The scent of exhaust and old asphalt lingered, but nothing familiar. No trace of home. His instinct stirred. He had to move. With stiff legs, Max pushed himself up, his paws slipping slightly on the ice. He took a few hesitant steps, his body protesting each movement. His limbs felt sluggish, the cold having drained him of his usual strength. But staying here meant freezing. He had to find shelter. The town was quiet, its streets nearly deserted in the late-night hour. Max wandered between buildings, his nose close to the ground, searching for anything familiar. The wind howled through narrow alleyways, rattling loose signs and sending trash skittering across the pavement. His ears flicked at the sound, his body tense. Ahead, a faint smell caught his attention, something warm, something edible. His stomach clenched with renewed hunger, urging him forward. His paws crunched over the frost-covered sidewalk as he followed the scent, leading him toward the back of a closed diner. A dumpster. Max hesitated, his ears pricking forward. He had never scavenged for food before. His meals had always been given to him, placed neatly in a bowl by someone he trusted. But now there was no bowl, no Frank, no home. Carefully, he crept closer, his nose twitching as he sniffed at the discarded food scraps. It wasn't much, but the scent alone made his mouth water. Just as he lowered his head, a low growl rumbled through the darkness. Max froze. A shadow moved near the dumpster, followed by another, then another. Yellow eyes gleamed in the dim light, reflecting the distant glow of a street lamp. A pack of stray dogs emerged from the shadows, their fur bristling, their bodies lean from hunger. The largest of them, a scarred mutt with matted fur, stepped forward. His lips curled back, revealing sharp teeth. His growl deepened, a warning. Max's body tensed. He was strong, well-trained, but exhaustion had weakened him. He didn't want to fight. He lowered his head slightly, keeping his posture neutral. He wasn't here to challenge them. He just needed food, just enough to get him through the night. The leader wasn't convinced. A sudden snap of jaws, a warning lunge. Max barely dodged, his paws slipping on the ice. His breath came out in rapid puffs, his body coiled to react. The pack closed in. Max took a step back, then another. His tail hung low, his muscles trembling from more than just the cold. He wasn't built for this kind of survival. Not like them. A sharp bark cut through the air, followed by a flash of movement. One of the smaller strays lunged, its teeth aiming for Max's leg. Instinct took over. Max twisted, but his balance was off. His paws skidded, and suddenly he was falling. His body hit the ice with a harsh thud, the breath knocked from his lungs. Pain shot through his side where he landed, but he had no time to recover. The leader took his chance, a blur of fur, a growl too close, then an impact. Max yelped as the force of the attack sent him sliding across the frozen ground. His side scraped against the rough pavement, stinging with fresh pain. The pack didn't chase him. They had made their point. He wasn't welcome here. Dazed and shaking, Max forced himself up. His legs wobbled beneath him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He limped away, ears still flicking back for any sign of pursuit. The world felt darker now. The hunger, the cold, the ache in his body, all of it paled in comparison to the weight pressing against his chest. It was more than exhaustion, more than fear. It was the realization that he truly had nowhere to go. As he wandered through the empty streets, his vision blurred slightly. The snow continued to fall, dusting his fur in a fine layer of white. His breath came in shallow bursts, each step heavier than the last. He had never been alone before, never had to fend for himself. But now, in the heart of a frozen city, Max was just another stray. The wind howled like a living thing, a relentless force that tore through the abandoned streets, sending spirals of snow whipping through the air. The storm had arrived in full fury, swallowing the town in a suffocating white veil. The streetlights flickered weakly, their glow barely penetrating the blizzard that raged on. Visibility was near zero. Buildings, cars, even the distant outlines of street signs had faded into the storm's grasp. The world was a blur of ice and wind, and in the midst of it all, Max stumbled forward. His legs trembled, his paws sinking into the deepening snow with every sluggish step. The freezing wind cut into his body like sharp needles, seeping through his thick fur and into his bones. He had been cold before, but this was something else. His entire body shuddered involuntarily, his breath coming in weak, misty puffs. Each inhale burned his throat, and each exhale barely made it past his chattering teeth. Still, he pressed on. The instinct to survive overrode the exhaustion weighing him down. His ears, half frozen, barely twitched at the muted sounds of the city buried beneath the storm. He moved aimlessly, no destination in mind. Only the primal urge to keep going. To stop meant to succumb to the cold, to let it pull him under like the snowdrifts piling up around him. But his strength was failing. His vision wavered, his once focused eyes now heavy with exhaustion. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, for warmth that didn't exist. His mind, clouded with fatigue, barely registered his surroundings. The storm had stripped the world of its landmarks, leaving only an endless expanse of white. Then, through the chaotic flurry of snow, a distant rumble cut through the air. It started as a low vibration beneath his paws, a deep rhythmic thudding that sent a faint tremor through the frozen ground. Max's ears perked, but his movements were sluggish, delayed by the creeping numbness overtaking his limbs. The sound grew louder, a mechanical growl, powerful and unwavering. The steady crunch of heavy tires against ice, a vehicle, a truck. It barreled down the road at high speed, its headlights piercing through the storm in two sharp beams. The driver couldn't see much, the wipers struggling against the accumulating frost on the windshield. Snow swirled aggressively, distorting the road ahead. The tires skidded slightly as the truck pressed forward, plowing through the unforgiving conditions. Max, unaware, continued his slow, staggering walk. The truck was coming fast. The moment stretched, each second carrying the weight of impending disaster. Then, light. A blinding flash of white flooded Max's vision as the headlights swallowed him whole. He blinked, momentarily frozen in place, his brain struggling to process the sudden illumination. His paws hesitated mid-step, his body stiffening as if his instincts had finally screamed through the fog of exhaustion. Then came the sound, the deafening screech of tires, the high-pitched wail of brakes locking against the ice. The driver saw him, too late. The massive vehicle fishtailed, the weight of it carrying forward despite the driver's desperate attempts to swerve. The force of its movement displaced the snow on the road, sending a spray of ice and powder into the air. The storm swallowed the noise, but for Max, time had already slowed. For the first time since Frank had driven away, fear gripped him. His legs tensed, his breath hitched. Then, impact. Not a brutal bone-crushing force, but a glancing blow. The edge of the truck's fender clipped Max's side, sending him sprawling into the snowbank. His body tumbled, limbs flailing for purchase that didn't exist. The world tilted, sky, ground, snow, until everything blurred together in a dizzying spiral. Then, stillness. Max lay motionless, half buried in the fresh snow. His breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. Pain radiated from his ribs, a dull ache that pulsed with every inhale. His mind, sluggish and dazed, barely registered the muffled sounds around him. The storm howled on. The truck's engine rumbled faintly in the distance, but the driver never stopped. Whether they had assumed the snowdrift had cushioned whatever they hit or simply hadn't noticed, the vehicle disappeared into the night, its red tail lights fading behind the curtain of white. Max didn't move. The cold crept closer now, wrapping around him like an unwelcome embrace. His body refused to respond, exhaustion dragging him deeper into the frozen ground. His eyes fluttered, his consciousness teetering on the edge. Was this it? Had he truly reached the end? His mind drifted back to warmer days, to the sound of Frank's voice calling his name, to the feeling of a strong hand scratching behind his ears, the rhythmic thump of his tail against the floor, to a time when he had a home, a place where he belonged. But that was gone now. The snow continued to fall, soft and unyielding. Each flake that landed on his fur felt heavier than the last, pressing him down, burying him further into the quiet embrace of winter. Then, a new sound. Faint at first, barely audible over the wind. Footsteps, crunching against ice, growing closer. A voice, distant, but urgent. "Oh my God, do you see that?" The crunch of boots quickened, the beam of a flashlight sweeping across the snow-covered ground. It flickered over a still shape, a patch of dark fur against the sea of white. A gasp. "It's a dog!" Another pair of footsteps approached, heavier, more deliberate. "Is he alive?" A pause, then warmth. Fingers pressing against his side, careful but searching. A sigh of relief. "He's breathing, but barely." Max didn't register the hands lifting him, wrapping something thick and warm around his frozen body. He didn't feel the shift as he was carried, cradled against something solid and secure. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel cold, didn't feel alone, didn't feel forgotten. As the car door shut behind him, enclosing him in a space filled with warmth, Max let himself drift further into the darkness, trusting, for the first time in a long time, that he would wake up to something better. The wind howled against the car windows, rattling the vehicle as it inched forward through the blizzard. The snow had come down fast, coating the road in a thick, unbroken layer of white. Visibility was nearly non-existent. The headlights barely cut through the swirling frost, turning everything beyond them into an endless void. Hannah Foster gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles stiff from the cold despite the heat blasting from the vents. She had been out in storms before. Working at an animal rescue shelter meant late-night calls, emergency pickups, and searching for lost, forgotten souls on nights just like this. But something about tonight felt different. Next to her, Sam Walker was hunched over, eyes scanning the road ahead. His jaw was tight, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by quiet focus. He had been doing this job for years, just like Hannah. They had seen all kinds of cases. Dogs abandoned in fields, tied to fences, left on the side of highways. But it never got easier. "Keep your eyes open," Hannah murmured, barely audible over the wind. Sam nodded, peering through the frost-covered windshield. "If there's anything out here, we're lucky to find it before morning." Hannah hated that thought. A night like this could be deadly, for anyone caught outside, human or animal. And yet, there was that feeling again, an unease creeping up her spine, an instinct telling her that something, or someone, needed them. Then, through the haze of snow and ice, something caught her eye. A dark shape, half buried in a snowbank near the side of the road. At first it looked like just another drift, but as they got closer she saw it, motionless, barely distinguishable against the white landscape. "Stop the car," she said sharply. Sam didn't hesitate. The tires skidded slightly as the vehicle came to a halt. Before Hannah could even unbuckle her seatbelt, she was already reaching for the door handle, the cold rushing in the moment she stepped out. The wind nearly knocked her back, but she braced herself, pulling her coat tighter around her body. She hurried through the snow, her boots crunching over the ice. As she got closer, her breath caught in her throat. It was a dog, a large German shepherd, curled into himself, his fur dusted with snow. His body was unnaturally still, his breathing so faint it was almost imperceptible. His paws were stiff, barely twitching with life. Hannah dropped to her knees beside him, her heart pounding. "Hey there," she whispered, reaching out carefully. Her fingers brushed against his fur, cold, too cold. She pressed her palm gently against his side, searching for movement. A weak rise and fall. He was still breathing, but just barely. "Sam," she called over her shoulder, urgency clear in her voice. "He's alive, but he won't be for long if we don't move fast." Sam was already there, shrugging off his thick rescue jacket. Without a word, he wrapped it around the dog's fragile body, his movements quick but gentle. "Poor guy," he muttered, his voice softer now. "How long do you think he's been out here?" Hannah didn't answer. She didn't want to think about it. Sam worked swiftly, tucking the dog into the folds of the insulated fabric, lifting him carefully into his arms. The dog barely reacted, his body limp from exhaustion. Hannah ran back to the vehicle, flinging open the back door as Sam followed, carefully setting the dog down on the back seat. Hannah climbed in next to him, immediately adjusting the heat vent to blow directly onto him. Up close, she could see the full extent of his condition. He was thin, his ribs barely visible beneath his thick fur. His paws were raw from the ice, his fur matted with frost. But what broke her heart the most was his face. The quiet resignation in his eyes, as if he had already accepted his fate. Hannah swallowed hard, brushing snow from his muzzle. "You're safe now," she murmured, unsure if he could even hear her. The dog didn't move much, but a small sound escaped him, a barely audible sigh, a sound of surrender. She felt something tighten in her chest. "Let's get him back to the shelter," Sam said from the front seat, shifting the car into drive. Hannah nodded, but her eyes never left the dog. She had rescued a lot of animals in her life, but something about this one felt different. Something about him made her wonder, who had he been waiting for out there in the cold? And why had they never come back? The shelter was warm, almost too warm compared to the freezing night outside. The sudden change in temperature was jarring, but it was necessary. Max lay on the examination table, wrapped in a thick blanket, his body still trembling despite the heat now surrounding him. The room smelled of antiseptic, clean but sterile, a stark contrast to the bitter cold and snow he had endured just hours ago. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly as the veterinary team moved quickly around him. Hannah stood to the side, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching intently as Dr. Bennett, the shelter's lead veterinarian, carefully ran his hands along Max's thin frame. The German shepherd barely reacted, his body limp, his breathing shallow. Every rise and fall of his chest was slow, measured, like he was running on the last reserves of energy he had left. "He's severely underweight," Dr. Bennett murmured, pressing gently along Max's ribs. His voice was steady, but Hannah could hear the concern beneath it. "Dehydrated, too. His paws are raw from the ice. He's been out there for a while." "How long do you think?" Hannah asked quietly. Dr. Bennett sighed, shaking his head. "Hard to say. Days, maybe a week. But it's not just exposure. This dog didn't just get lost in a storm. He was abandoned." The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken sadness. Hannah already knew it, of course. She had seen enough cases like this to recognize the signs. The way Max hadn't fought when they picked him up, the way he barely reacted to touch, the way he had just lain there in the snow, waiting for someone who was never coming back. Sam, who had been standing in the doorway, let out a low breath. "I'll get the scanner," he said, disappearing into the hallway. Microchips had become a standard procedure in shelters, a way to track lost pets and reunite them with their families. But Hannah had done this long enough to know that a chip didn't always mean a happy ending. A few moments later, Sam returned with the scanner in hand. He stepped beside the table, gently passing the device over Max's neck. A soft beep echoed through the room. Hannah's stomach tightened. The scanner blinked to life, displaying a string of numbers on its tiny screen. Sam frowned slightly, then turned the device toward Dr. Bennett. "Got a match." Dr. Bennett nodded, pulling a laptop closer and typing in the ID number. The screen loaded for a moment before a file popped up. A moment of silence followed. Then, Dr. Bennett's brow furrowed. "That's unusual." Hannah leaned in. "What is it?" Dr. Bennett turned the screen so she could see. A profile appeared. Max's information, basic details, vaccination records. But it wasn't just a standard file. There was something else, something she hadn't expected. 2 adoption records, 2 returns. Her breath caught in her throat. "He's been surrendered before?" "Twice," Dr. Bennett confirmed. His voice was careful, measured, but Hannah could feel the weight behind his words. She glanced down at Max, lying motionless on the table. The pieces started clicking into place. His quiet resignation, the way he hadn't fought to survive, the way he had just given up. This wasn't his first time being left behind. Hannah's hands curled into fists. "Who was the last registered owner?" Dr. Bennett scrolled down, his eyes darkening as he read the name. "Frank Dawson." A surge of frustration rose in Hannah's chest. She had heard that name before. Frank Dawson, someone who had a history of abandoning pets, not just Max, but others. And now, he had done it again. Left a dog out in the freezing cold, alone, to fend for himself. She swallowed down the anger burning at the back of her throat. "And the first owner?" she asked. Dr. Bennett tapped a few more keys and another name appeared. A different family, a different location, and a nearly identical note in the file. "Surrendered due to behavioral issues." Hannah's stomach twisted. She looked back at Max, at the quiet sadness in his eyes, and felt something inside her tighten. Behavioral issues. That wasn't it. She had seen aggressive dogs before, Scared ones, reactive ones that had been mistreated so badly that they didn't know how to trust anymore. Max wasn't one of them. He wasn't aggressive. He was broken. Broken by people who had promised to love him, only to throw him away when it was inconvenient. "He's been waiting," she murmured almost to herself. Sam glanced at her. "What?" Hannah shook her head. "He waited for them, out in the cold. He thought they were coming back." Her voice wavered slightly. "But they never did." No one in the room spoke for a long moment. Max let out a quiet sigh, his body shifting slightly under the warmth of the blanket. For the first time, his ears twitched, just barely. He was listening. Hannah exhaled slowly, brushing a hand lightly over his fur. "Well," she said, her voice quieter now, steadier. "That's not happening again?" Sam gave her a knowing look. "You're thinking of keeping him, aren't you?" She hesitated, but only for a moment. "I don't know," she admitted. "But what I do know is that he's not getting abandoned again." Sam smirked slightly, shaking his head. "You always say that." Hannah glanced down at Max. His breathing was slow but steady, his body finally starting to relax. She knew better than to make promises she couldn't keep. But looking at him now, she felt something stir in her chest. Something fierce, something determined. This time, someone had to fight for him, and she wasn't going to let him down. The shelter was quiet in the early afternoon, the usual hum of conversation and distant barking softened by the stillness of the moment. Volunteers moved through the rows of kennels, checking on the dogs, some of whom eagerly wagged their tails, pressing their noses against the metal bars, hoping for attention. Others lay curled up in their corners, their eyes weary, their spirits dulled by too many days spent waiting. Max was one of the latter. Since the night he had been rescued, he had barely moved from the back of his kennel. He ate when food was placed in front of him, but slowly, as if he wasn't sure it belonged to him. He accepted the warmth of blankets, but never curled into them for comfort. When volunteers tried to coax him out for walks, he followed obediently, but without enthusiasm. It was as if he had resigned himself to the routine: wait, eat, sleep, wait some more. It wasn't that Max was aggressive. It wasn't even that he was fearful. It was something worse. He had given up. And then one day, someone new walked into the shelter. Daniel Carter wasn't the kind of man who stood out at first glance. He wasn't loud, wasn't overbearing, didn't rush into places demanding attention. He carried himself with a quiet steadiness, the kind of presence that didn't need to be announced. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his once dark hair now peppered with silver. His flannel jacket was well worn, his boots scuffed from years of walking paths that only men like him walked. His face bore the lines of time, not just age, but experience, loss, and memories he didn't speak of. He had seen enough in his life to know what waiting looked like. Hannah noticed him the moment he entered, though he didn't approach the front desk right away. Instead, he walked slowly down the aisles of kennels, taking his time, stopping every now and then to glance at the dogs watching him. Some barked, some wagged their tails eagerly. He didn't react much, simply nodding here and there, a small, almost imperceptible flicker of emotion crossing his face. Then he reached Max's kennel. Unlike the other dogs, Max didn't react. He didn't rush forward, didn't wag his tail. He simply lifted his head from his paws and stared. Daniel crouched down, resting his arms on his knees, his fingers lacing together loosely. He didn't say anything. Max's ears flicked slightly, his eyes locked onto the man's. There was something different here, something quieter than what he was used to. People always spoke to him, called his name, tried to coax him closer, offered treats in hopes of earning his trust. Daniel did none of that. He just waited. Seconds passed, then a full minute, then another. Max, still lying down, slowly lifted his head a little higher. His dark brown eyes studied the man in front of him, searching for something. Daniel let out a quiet breath. "You remind me of someone," he murmured. His voice was low, steady, calm. Max didn't move at first, but his ears twitched slightly at the sound. "I had a dog once," Daniel continued, his gaze still locked with Max's. "His name was Rex. He was a good one, like you." At the sound of the name, Max blinked. The smallest, barely noticeable flick of his tail brushed against the floor behind him. Daniel didn't react. He simply let the moment settle. Slowly, cautiously, Max moved. It was subtle at first, just the shifting of his paws beneath him, the slight adjustment of his weight. Then, with deliberate slowness, he lifted himself up, standing on all fours for the first time in hours. His legs, though steady, carried an air of hesitation. One step forward, then another. Daniel didn't move. Max stopped just short of the kennel bars, his nose twitching, scenting the air between them. There was something familiar here, something different from the others who had passed by. Daniel slowly lifted his hand, palm open, fingers relaxed. He didn't reach through the bars, he didn't try to touch. He let Max decide. A long pause stretched between them. Then, cautiously, Max lowered his head and pressed his nose lightly against Daniel's outstretched palm. The contact was brief, just a whisper of trust. But it was enough. Daniel's fingers curled slightly, just the barest movement, as if acknowledging the moment without pushing it further. Max didn't pull away. Hannah, who had been watching from a distance, felt something tighten in her chest. She had seen a lot of first meetings before. Some were filled with excitement, tails wagging, dogs jumping up eagerly against the kennel doors, desperate for attention. Others were more hesitant, more unsure. But this was different. This was recognition. Daniel let out a slow breath, his hand still resting lightly against the bars. "I think we understand each other, don't we?" he murmured. Max blinked slowly, and then, for the first time since he had arrived at the shelter, his tail wagged, just once, just enough. Daniel's lips twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. He pulled his hand back, resting it on his knee again. He didn't need to say anything else. Hannah stepped forward, clearing her throat softly. "You thinking about adopting?" she asked, keeping her voice careful, measured. Daniel hesitated, glancing back at Max before standing up slowly. "I don't know," he admitted. "I wasn't planning on it." Hannah studied him. "But?" Daniel exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "But I woke up this morning and knew I had to come here." Hannah nodded, glancing back at Max, who was still standing by the bars, watching the man as if he wasn't quite ready to let him go just yet. She smiled slightly. "Well," she said, "maybe that's a sign." Daniel didn't respond right away. He simply looked at Max again, at the way the dog stood there, waiting, not desperate, not pleading, just waiting, like he had been waiting for something, or someone. And for the first time in a long time, maybe Max had finally found it. The air in the shelter was thick with quiet anticipation. The decision had been made, though Daniel hadn't voiced it yet. He didn't need to. It was there in the way he stood in front of Max's kennel, in the way his fingers rested lightly against the bars, in the way Max, for the first time since arriving at the shelter, didn't retreat into the shadows of his small space. He just stood there, watching, waiting. Hannah, standing a few feet away, held her breath. She had seen potential adopters hesitate before, had seen them weigh their options, listing the pros and cons of taking in a dog with a past like Max's. But Daniel wasn't hesitating. He was simply feeling the moment, making sure that what he already knew in his heart was the right choice. Finally, Daniel let out a breath, long and slow. He turned to Hannah, his expression unreadable, but his voice steady. "This guy deserves a real home." Hannah felt warmth bloom in her chest. She nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "Yeah," she agreed. "He really does." The adoption paperwork was straightforward, though it felt heavier than most. This wasn't just about finding a dog a home. This was about giving Max something he had lost long ago: stability, love, the simple promise that this time he wouldn't be left behind. As Hannah filled out the final details, she glanced at Daniel. "Are you sure?" she asked. Not because she doubted him, but because Max had already been let down too many times. Daniel met her gaze, his eyes clear, unwavering. "Yeah," he said simply. "I'm sure." The moment the kennel door opened, Max didn't bolt out like some dogs did. He stepped forward cautiously, his ears flicking back and forth as if trying to process what was happening. Daniel crouched down, waiting, just as he had the first time they met. He didn't rush, didn't call Max over. He simply let the dog decide. And Max did. Slowly, hesitantly, he walked up to Daniel, his nose twitching as he sniffed the man's outstretched hand. There was no hesitation in Daniel's touch when he reached out, fingers brushing against Max's fur. It was steady, reassuring. "Let's go home," Daniel murmured. Max didn't understand the words, not really, but he understood the tone. This wasn't a command, it was a promise. For the first time in what felt like forever, Max stepped forward with someone instead of chasing after them. The drive home was silent, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Max sat in the passenger seat, curled into the warmth of the truck's interior. He didn't tremble. He didn't fidget. He simply was, present in the moment, feeling the vibration of the road beneath them, the low hum of the engine, the occasional glance Daniel threw his way as if making sure this wasn't all just some fragile illusion. Max had been in a car before, but this time, the car wasn't leaving him behind. When they pulled into the driveway of Daniel's small but well-kept home, the reality of it settled in. Daniel turned off the engine and looked at Max, who was staring out the window, ears perked but relaxed. "We're here," Daniel said softly, reaching over to open the door. Max didn't hesitate. He jumped down, his paws landing on solid ground. Not ice, not concrete, but something that felt stable. The air was cold, but it was different than the biting frost that had once threatened to consume him. This cold was temporary, softened by the warm glow coming from the house just a few feet away. Daniel led the way to the door, unlocking it and stepping inside. Max hesitated at the threshold for only a moment before following. The warmth hit him immediately, the scent of wood and something faintly familiar. Home. Home. The word held no meaning to him before. It had been a concept, something fleeting, something that always seemed to slip through his grasp. But as he padded inside, as Daniel set his keys down and shrugged off his coat, Max felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Safety. The fire in the living room crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Max walked closer, drawn to the warmth. He circled once, twice, before finally settling down on the thick rug in front of it. His body, still thin but no longer trembling, finally relaxed. Daniel watched him from the doorway, a soft expression on his face. He walked over, crouching down beside Max and running a hand gently over his fur. "Welcome home, kid," he murmured. Max let out a slow, content sigh, his body sinking further into the warmth of the room, the warmth of belonging. For the first time, he didn't have to wait. He didn't have to wonder. He didn't have to chase after something he would never catch. He was home. Somewhere in the quiet, somewhere between the soft crackling of the fire and the rhythmic rise and fall of Max's breath, a truth settled in, one that didn't need words, one that had existed long before this moment but had only just found its place. Dogs never abandon their people, and maybe, just maybe, people shouldn't abandon them either. This story is more than just a tale of survival. It's a testament to loyalty, resilience, and the power of second chances. Max's journey reflects the heartbreaking reality of many abandoned animals, left to fend for themselves despite their unwavering devotion. But it also serves as a reminder that kindness can heal even the deepest wounds. Daniel didn't just rescue Max. Max rescued him too, proving that love, once lost, can always be found again. In the end, this story teaches us a simple yet profound truth. Dogs never give up on us, and we should never give up on them. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.